across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we do like to talk about theology and philosophy and apologetics, and we're going to be focusing on a book today, Why I Am Not an Atheist, and if that title sounds familiar, well, of course, it parallels a book of probably a very well-known book by Bertrand Russell, kind of a classic text, Why I'm Not a Christian. And this is really a great story of an individual who grew up in a Catholic background, maybe you could better say in the Catholic world. And after about a time, about 25 years ago, reading this book and many other things, while he was at Princeton perhaps as well, began to give up on this idea of God. And I think as we go through his spiritual pilgrimage, we'll also learn a great deal about some of the philosophers we've talked about here in the past on Point of View, as well, of course, many times we've had conversations about the so-called new atheist, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the rest. And so we want to welcome to the microphone today the former editor of Harper's Magazine, Christopher Beha, and he is an individual that has written a number of things, The Whole 5 Feet, a number of novels, Arts and Entertainments, What Happened to Sophie Wilder, his most recent novel, which I've heard about, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. But we're going to be talking about this book, Why I Am Not an Atheist, The Confessions of a Skeptical Believer. So, Christopher, welcome to Point of View.
Thanks very much for having me.
The book came out in February, and I would imagine by now you're getting quite a number of comments. We do have information if people wanted to order it, although I suspect they'll be able to find it in the bookstore. But I've seen some of the early reports, but what's happening now that the book's been out for a little bit of time?
Well, the response has been pretty great. I've been very pleased with it, and it has initiated a lot of interesting conversations so far, so that's been good.
Well, again, we will work our way through a lot of philosophers all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, all the way up to John Stuart Mill, and of course, Bertrand Russell, and maybe even some of the existentialists like Albert Camus and Kant and the rest. But I thought for just a few minutes, we do need to maybe know your story because, in a sense, all the way through the book, you're telling your story. And again, about 24 years ago, you began to say, there seems to be a lot better evidence for atheism than for my Catholic background, and I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I suppose it's not even a matter that it started with the question of evidence, but what happened, I was raised in a very devout family, and then I had a few, when I was in college at Princeton, as you said, I had a few life events. One was a very bad accident that my identical twin brother, with whom I'm very close, had, and another was a bout with cancer that I had. But I had some real close brushes with mortality, and I started to really be bothered by a problem that a lot of believers have spent time thinking about, which is the problem of suffering.
Right.
And why it is that this God that we understand to be both benevolent and all-powerful would allow there to be this suffering. It wasn't even my own suffering, to be honest, but it was because, in a way, my prayers were answered in those areas. My brother survived. I survived. But it was the understanding from that experience that so many other people had not been spared that way. That the worst case scenario that hadn't happened to us does happen to other people. Some people, their brother at 18 gets hit by the car and doesn't survive, or they get the cancer diagnosis at 22 and they don't survive. And that really, the idea of that caused real problems for me. And it was not, I didn't want to believe for a second that we'd been spared because we prayed, because then that meant that God was looking down and punishing the people, one room over at the hospital who didn't pray. And in fact, I also knew people who were much more devout than I was, really, who I think were just better people than I was, who had not been spared in that way. So I couldn't simply chalk it up to saying, well, some people don't get so lucky as I do, but that's because we go to church on Sunday. And so that started leading me down a path of really questioning things. And then while I was going down that path, I came across this book you mentioned by Bertrand Russell called Why I'm Not a Christian. And that's when I started to see a lot of the philosophical arguments against theism. And I came to them at a time where I suppose you could say, emotionally open to them.
Sure.
I was ready to be talked out of my faith. And then I started to encounter these books that started to do that. You mentioned the New Atheists. I graduated from college in 2002, so I'm coming into my 20s, into early adulthood, as a kind of budding atheist, right at the time that all these writers are starting to appear.
Yeah, best-selling books.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I read a lot of them. But what I became very quickly faced with was the question of, okay, if I don't believe in God, what do I believe in instead? And, the New Atheists, and, we can get into them if you'd like, but in a way, they weren't even really that relevant to me because their project was talking people out of belief. And I was already there. I wanted to know now what. And they don't spend a ton of time on that.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And now many atheists would say, when I say I wanted to know what to believe now, they'd say, oh, no, you've got it all wrong. Then you're still kind of psychologically under the sway of this religious world in which you were raised, because you think you need beliefs to get through the world. But we atheists, we have facts. We just see the world in front of us. And that didn't seem correct to me. It just seemed obvious that you have certain questions, particularly moral and ethical questions, questions about how do I live my life, that can't be answered factually. They can't be answered scientifically through empirical study of the evidence. It doesn't mean atheists can't have morality. What it does mean is that once you have made the decision not to believe in God, you still must believe in something. You must have some sense, some worldview, some sense of the way the world is that is going to allow you to get through the world and operate in it. So what I gave up very soon was the version of atheism that I think is embraced by a lot of the new atheists, which is basically one that says there is a common sense reality that anyone who has not been tricked by this superstitious belief in a sky daddy shares, and being an atheist just means living in that reality. It doesn't mean having beliefs. I knew I needed a worldview, and that's the story of what happened next. Is my effort.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the aspects of this with Christopher Beha, Why I Am Not an Atheist, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Western civilization rests upon Christian values, and Western civilization is worth saving. That was the theme of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's message at the Munich Security Conference. He reminded the Europeans of our shared heritage. He said, the men who settled and built the nation of my birth arrived on our shores carrying the memories and traditions and the Christian faith of their ancestors as a sacred inheritance, an unbreakable link between old world and the new. He added, we are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization for which we have fallen heir. Many seem to be rediscovering the truth that Christianity gave us Western culture, and it is necessary for it to function. We've seen many atheists who often surprise their audiences by acknowledging this fact and lauding the need for continued dependence on Christian values. Historian Tom Holland has been on my radio program to talk about his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. He argues that our Western world is deeply rooted in Christian ideas, and even our attitudes today are shaped by a Christian worldview that values human dignity, charity, and protection of the weak. He wrote those words as a secular historian, though I hear he has now become a Christian. Marco Rubio's speech was a reminder of the Christian foundations of our world and the need to return to those Christian values. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Christopher Beha, Why I Am Not an Atheist, the Confessions of a Skeptical Believer. And I do want to get to some of the philosophers that you quote throughout your book because there's such a great insight in that regard. But since we were talking about your story for just a minute, early on you do talk about the fact that during your 20s and early 30s, you contemplated suicide. And again, if you say there is no supernatural, there is no God, there's no right or wrong, there is just the world, and all of the world around me is a result of chance, and it's not going to make any sense, to use some of the phrases from Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and people like that. You could understand why that would be the case, because if you're trying to find meaning and your atheist friends are saying, well, there's no meaning, and you're wasting your time trying to find meaning, you can see why some of those thoughts might surface.
Yeah, there's an extensive existentialist tradition that holds that, given the reality of the world, the atheist view of the world, the great question is whether or not to go on living in this meaningless world. That's the question that Albert Camus says is the only serious philosophical question, is the question of suicide. The one thing we have is our own will, our own choice, and included in that choice is the choice at any time to opt out, as it were.
So again, I just would love to get into some of the philosophy. You know, one of the things we've done in the past with Dr. Doug Groothuis, he wrote a book called Philosophy in 7 Sentences, where he'll take Socrates, and examine life is not worth living, or Aristotle, all men by nature desire to know, or Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and help educate us about some of the philosophers. But you early on do quote from Plato, Aristotle, even Thomas Aquinas. Maybe some of that comes from your Catholic background. And so before we get to the Enlightenment and a lot of the arguments for atheism, it does seem to me that they were making arguments, even if you felt that Bertrand Russell was trying to critique them. But how did you kind of navigate through some of that material, since that's kind of the early part of your book?
Yeah, well, I try to go back. I did learn about some of these medieval Catholic philosophers throughout my education. I went to a Catholic high school where there were Jesuit priests teaching me some of these things. But I wanted to, as I said before, I wanted kind of secular answers to these questions. So I tried to go back to the point in history, the time of the end of the medieval era into the Renaissance and early Enlightenment, when the authority of a figure like Aquinas, who was essentially combining a reading of Aristotle with a reading of the Bible, an authority of a figure like that was starting to lessen, and people were starting to ask themselves, you know, what is going to replace it? And the thing that I said earlier, which is that something does have to replace it, that there isn't just a common sense reality once belief is stripped away. Those people were quite aware of that fact. They were quite conscious of the fact, because they knew what was being lost. They were being removed from this sort of worldview of Christendom. And it's only because of all the work they did in building something to replace it that people can now take for granted that there is this other thing and can treat that as just neutral reality. So I became very interested in these figures. Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, is one of them. René Descartes, Francis Bacon, and then moving up into the empiricists, John Locke and Hume, moving forward, who really were very aware that they needed to construct something new and to think about how they went about doing it.
Let's get into that then, because, of course, Francis Bacon puts you into that world of Descartes you just mentioned, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. Those are individuals, many of whom preceded, before we even get to Charles Darwin and some of the other individuals, or certainly even later the existentialists. And the effort was, okay, if we can't make sense of this from an idea of biblical revelation, then really all we have, if you will, is ultimately the scientific method. And if there's a theme, one of the many themes that run through your book, because I've read some of the other things that people have written about your book, is that science can't always give you the answer. But there was kind of that scientific, materialistic hope for a while that science would give us all the answers we needed, and we wouldn't need to even think about God or the supernatural. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that those early thinkers were not saying that they were not atheists. They were not saying that God did not exist. But what they were saying was that we couldn't trust revelation or biblical authority or church authority to answer questions about the nature of reality. We had to rely on our own personal experience. And in so doing, they ultimately came to believe we had to limit ourselves to the material reality that we do experience, that we have sort of a shared experience of. They really wanted to objectify knowledge. They wanted to say that what it meant for something to be true was for it to be a statement about some object in the world that you and I could both observe from our different vantage points. And that also meant, and this was a really important step for these early figures, stripping out our emotions, our wants and needs and hopes, and saying that's something that we bring to our experience. But there's this other piece of our experience, which is that thing out there that we are experiencing. And that's what truth is knowing that thing being material reality. Now, very quickly, that starts to get complicated by a lot of these thinkers. One of the complications is that because we only experience things subjectively, because we really only have our experiences, we don't have unmediated access to that world. We can't know what the world is, the world out there. This project of stripping out our own emotions and our own subjectivity, that's always going to be ultimately impossible. And some people, Immanuel Kant is a really important figure in this. Right. He went so far as to say that in his view, time and space themselves were things that human perception or cognition brought to the picture. Everyone knows, for example, that, scientists would tell you, right, that color doesn't exist out in the world, right? There are light waves of various frequencies, and our way of experiencing those things are to experience light at certain frequencies as red and at others as blue. They would also say the same thing about sound. There are waves in the air that our ears take in and experience as sound, right? But those things are what some of these philosophers would call secondary qualities. The primary qualities are the physical material reality of air in motion or of light waves fluctuating. But he would say it's all secondary. It's all sort of being made by us as we experience it, Kant would say. And so he sends, Kant was also a believer, but there's a whole range of atheist thinkers who follow Kant, so that atheism splits off. On one hand, there's the materialism that we've talked about with the scientific empirical worldview that says that we can have knowledge of a material reality out there through science. But then on the other hand, there's this other thing, which is an idealist tradition.
Romantic idealism, yeah.
Yes. That is the existentialist tradition. That's the tradition of Nietzsche. That's the tradition of a lot of frankly, the most exciting atheists. This is not the tradition of the new atheists. It's not the tradition of Darwin or of Dawkins. It's the tradition of a Nietzsche type who sort of says we can make the whole world in our image. We can will a world into existence because the thing that the world is our imagining. It's not a reality out there. So I got very interested in the fact that there were these two major strains of atheism. And the second one, maybe in part because I'm a writer, I'm a fiction writer, I really do value the imagination. The second one was very exciting to me. That was the one that I really ascribed to for many years.
Romantic idealism. Let's take a break. When we come back, do want to maybe take for a few minutes on this whole idea of the rational proofs for God's existence, because it turns out we know a lot more about science than, say, David Hume knew, or even Charles Darwin or others, so we'll get into that. But then we'll just talk about what that might mean and how that has been significant in your own spiritual pilgrimage. We're talking about why I am not an atheist. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
There are so many big stories happening literally everywhere. So much information, documents released, grand jury testimony, political accusations and claims on all sides. How in the world can any of us keep up? How do we weed out the truly important from the merely sensational? None of us can do it alone. I've been in media for more than 45 years. I've trained my skills, and yet even with that, I am glad for the more than 50-year track record of the team here at Point of View. They help us to cut through the noise and focus on the authentically important. More than that, biblically informed eyes to help us understand and develop ways to respond effectively. Providing what we need takes time and resources, and your partnership makes it all possible. Click on into pointofview.net, hit the donate button, or call 1-800-347-5151. Please give today. Better, sign up and help monthly. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Christopher Beha. Book is entitled Why I Am Not an Atheist. And again, you probably can find the book in your local bookstore, but we also have information about him and the book on our website at pointofview.net. Christopher, for just a minute, before we get into this idea of romantic idealism, which is part of your book as well, I just wanted people to have a little bit of a sense of what scientific materialism or existentialism is like. And some quotes that I've used before when I teach on this topic. Daniel Dennett, for example, in the beginning there were no reasons, there were only causes. Nothing had a purpose, nothing has so much of a function, there is no teleology in the world at all. Or of course we mentioned Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins one time said, in the universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if is at the bottom. There's no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. You can understand why some people, if they hear those kinds of phrases or read that in books or even think through the implications, are suicidal. Even from where this studio is, there's a place down in Deep Ellum called Club Dada, and I speak there every once in a while, and that's heavy on nihilism. And it's just pretty dark, and that's really the world of atheism, isn't it?
Well, there are certainly a lot of atheists, including, I would say, Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who knew how to enjoy life very much. Dawkins could describe this vision of life and then say, but nonetheless, I enjoy a good glass of wine. And
you only go around once in life, so grab for all the gusto. Yes, I've heard that. Yes, many times.
Some of that may be slightly temperamental, but certainly there are people, and I am among them, who, faced with that world, find it quite dark. I'm referring to Bertrand Russell when I call it "Why I Am Not an Atheist," this book, but it also speaks to the fact that what I'm most concerned with doing is trying to give a rendering of my own experience.
Of course,
that's not to say I don't value apologetics. But as someone whose background is not in theology as such, but is as a novelist and a memoirist, I'm trying to tell a story that people can relate to, that can make coherent to people why one person who had found themselves within this atheist world would return to, a robust belief in God. And I can say, for me, I found the world that you're quoting Dawkins as describing a very difficult one to live with. Now, it's worth mentioning, of course, which you and I both know, is that, and this is what Dawkins would say, is it could still be true. The fact that it's so dark doesn't in itself invalidate it.
No.
But it does raise the question, how does one go about living in those kinds of circumstances?
And I'd like to get your thoughts, too, as a novelist for just a few minutes, because one of the programs we've done here, as a matter of fact, I was just at a conference recently with a neurophysiologist who recognizes that a lot of people saying there's no real mind, there's just a brain, and you think you have a mind. Well, if you're writing a story about a person that has to make a moral choice and everything is biologically predetermined, and that's not just the argument of certainly Richard Dawkins, but of Pinker, who you quote, and many others, you kind of lose that, because we write about and we experience the idea that there is hope, there is a future, that we can make moral choices. And you are writing novels that actually encourage us to think about the kind of choices people make. But if you take to its logical extension scientific materialism, a lot of that just evaporates, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think, I just said that the fact that there's something really grim about, to me and to you, if not to Dawkins or Hitchens, about the world that's described by materialism, that doesn't make me invalidate it. That doesn't mean it's not true. But to me, the things that materialism really has trouble with are, one, consciousness, as you just mentioned, and two, the other thing you mentioned, free will. We all experience ourselves as conscious agents capable of acting in the world. And the funny thing is, what empiricism tells us is that we should base our beliefs on our own experience. But then at the same time, what materialism tells us is, it doesn't matter that your experience tells you that you have consciousness and that you have free will. Because we scientists have actually determined that that's not the case. This is the story. There's only the brain. You only think you're conscious. The thing is, to think you're conscious is to be conscious. That's what consciousness is. I think there becomes about materialism something fundamentally contrary to our experience, rather than it being the version of reality that really holds close to empiricism. You started by asking me some questions about much more ancient philosophers, going back to Plato and Socrates.
Sure.
And it's worth noting that materialism, the view that all there is matter, is one of the oldest philosophies. It's not something that was invented in the 1500s or 1600s or invented by Thomas Hobbes as a response to the decline in religious belief. It has always been an option, and it has for most of history not been a very popular option, not because, including in the pre-Christian world, not because, somehow the Catholic Church was stomping it out through the Inquisition or something, but because it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to most people.
Yeah.
It actually is radically contrary to our experience to say that physical matter is all that exists, because we do have experience of mental events. We do have experience of things going on inside our heads that other people can't observe, that even someone who could, look at our brain in an MRI, while these things were going on, they still couldn't see them, It doesn't really make sense to say these thoughts you're having, they are your brain. They're not just caused by your brain, but they are your brain, which is what materialism says. That's a very strange notion, I think, to anyone who hasn't been trained into it.
And again, I think this is where science helps out as well. I mentioned just a minute ago, of course, some of the interviews we've done, but Dr. Michael Egner, the immortal mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. We can open up people's brains. We can make, for example, your arm, Christopher, move, and yet you're saying, well, I didn't make it move. You made me make it move, and you have a perfect understanding of when you made me move the arm and when I move my arm. And of course, all the questions about out-of-body experiences and all of that have all come together. Or even the other thought that I had was when you talk about some of these arguments and critiques against the proofs for God's existence, I'm thinking of Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, that really when you ended the 19th century, came into the 20th century, it was kind of like, well, Charles Darwin told us where we came from, Karl Marx told us where we're going, and a variety of other people tried to answer all the major questions like Sigmund Freud about human characteristics. And yet by now, with everything from the Big Bang to, of course, the fine-tuning of the universe to the detail of the soul, it's kind of a return of the God hypothesis. And in some respects, some of those critiques that were seen as so devastating against this idea of the existence of God or Christian faith actually have now had a renaissance, if you will, because of some of the science. So I don't think people saw that coming. And when we come back from a break, I'd love to get some of your thoughts about this, because, again, this is a book that might really cause people to, if they're in the process of searching, learn a little bit more about your investigation of some of those key people, whether it's, of course, the classical statements by Thomas Aquinas or the teaching of Francis Bacon or Thomas Hobbes or the ethical issues of John Stuart Mill, some of the writings of Bertrand Russell, the existentialists of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus or Immanuel Kant or even Nietzsche, or, of course, the so-called New Atheist. That is some information that, again, we have available on our website at pointofview.net. If you'd like to correspond with Christopher, we have a link to his website. It is ChristopherBeha.com. That gives you information about him, information about not only this book, but his other books. Perhaps you'd like to read some of his other writings in some respects, or some of the things that he has posted over the years at Harper's Magazine or the New York Review of Books. All of those resources are available at our website, pointofview.net, or of course you can go directly to that as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation on why I'm not an atheist. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Christopher Beha with us as we talk about his book, Why I'm Not an Atheist. And Christopher, for a minute, we might even focus on so what question. Why does this matter? Yesterday I posted a piece by Timothy Carney where religion exits, extremism enters. And he's talked about the fact that the country has become more secular. But then he even has a quote from Russ Douthat, who is, of course, a columnist at New York Times, and just heard him speak recently at an Anglican Anglican church down the road from where this studio is, in which he said, if you had a problem with the religious right, just wait till you meet the post-religious right. And he goes on to, that is, Timothy Carney goes on to say that in some respects, people that are secularists seem less tolerant, less pluralistic. And we've even had the Richard Dawkins of the world and others, many atheists, sometimes surprising their audience by acknowledging the fact that maybe dependence on Christian values is a good idea. So in some respects, some people might just think, well, what does it matter whether you're an atheist or a Christian, whether the culture is based on secular ideas or Christian ideas? But it really does matter if you are really concerned about human flourishing, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that there was a long time a feeling among a lot of secularists that there was a basic common sense human morality that everybody shared, or the vast majority of people shared, except for certain sort of sociopathic outliers, and that we could just get along on the basis of that. And in fact, what some of them would argue was that the only people who really deviated from that common sense morality were theists who were extremists or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think what many Christians have argued for a long time is no. What we have in the West is a morality that is based on Christian values, and then that morality is kind of hung around as Christianity has declined. But what you secularists are taking as common values are really your legacy from this Christian tradition. And sure enough, I think a lot of sort of relatively moderate, from that standpoint, atheists like a Dawkins, they look around and they start to see that as we get more and more removed from a society that explicitly understands its values as coming from Christianity,
right,
sure enough, a lot of those values are starting to go away, or they're starting to be less widely adopted. And that is, I think, why you have someone like Dawkins saying, well, culturally I'm a Christian because I recognize, these aren't universal values. They need a kind of cultural underpinning. But obviously what Dawkins would like is to be able to have that cultural underpinning without the metaphysical faith.
In your postlude, you talk about the fact that the claim God is love has become kind of a spiritual cliche, but I think it is something that really we need to come back to. We talked about this yesterday with one of my guests was talking about worldview, how some traditions talk about God's sovereignty, some talk about God is love, some talk about community, but it does seem to me that if we come back to, the Apostle Paul, faith, hope, and love, this idea of abiding in Christ and some of the things that have been our traditions, if you will, for millennia, it does seem to me that we need those particular ideas now more than ever in a polarized and pluralistic society. But I'd love to know your thoughts about that since, of course, you've written a 400-page book on the subject.
Yeah, no, I agree absolutely. And one of the things you mentioned is hope. And despair is such a problem in our time. Throughout the, we are polarized, but throughout the kind of spectrum, political spectrum, cultural spectrum, there's just a real sense of despair or a real lack of faith in the possibility of a better future, a lack of hope. And I think those things are badly needed. And then love. Yeah. I mean, I really do come back to what it means to treat love not as a neurological response that has been, hardwired into us by evolution because it helps us to propagate our genes, which is what the materialists would have, but also not as simply a subjective emotional feeling, which is what the idealists would have, but as a reality in the world, and also to think about the importance of not just feeling love, having this nice feeling in our hearts, but being called by love to do something in the world and to recognize the object of that love. So to me, where I wound up on my journey passing from materialism through idealism to, the body or the physical world on one hand and the mind and the emotional world on the other hand, is this sense that we live in a created order. It is both true that we are subjective selves, agents in the world,
yes,
and that there exists a world outside of us that isn't entirely of our own making, that we don't get to just determine through our own imaginations, and that all of these exist because of love. They were created out of the force of love, and that our job, our task, is to come to know this reality as well as we can, including the reality of other people, and to come to know this force that created this reality, and to love both of those things, which is obviously that's the two commandments that Jesus lays down to us: love God and love your neighbor. So it is. You can spend years and years, as I did, reading sometimes very abstruse philosophy, and then sometimes an event happens in your life out in the world that makes it all seem very simple. And I think many of us know some of the people we have whose faith we most admire. It's actually an incredibly simple and straightforward faith. They feel the reality of love, and they try to participate in that reality in the world.
Just before I let you go, let's again talk about your most recent novel, I think, is The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. Do we have some other novels coming out in the future, and what's the future for Christopher Beha?
I do. I have another novel, which I'm just finishing up now, which is actually slated to come out next year. I won't say that much more about it, but I will say that it's not my I felt a real calling. This is obviously if you make your faith the center of your life, you're going to feel a calling to try and express that to people. And I wanted to do that in this book. But ultimately, what I do is, first and foremost, I am a fiction writer, and I'm returning to that. But it informs everything I write.
Of course.
So my other books are not, explicitly, nonfiction books about belief, but they are about human beings grappling with all these same questions we all are. And so I think they will be of interest, the novels, I would hope, to anyone who's interested in this book.
Well, I appreciate you giving us an hour today. Thank you for writing such a long book, and I appreciate the conversation, and thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
We are going to take a break, and then we get back to the issues in the news, of which there are many. Going to focus a little more time and attention on what's happening in Iran today, just because it deserves a little more attention. But that won't be the only thing we'll be talking about, because we do have some other topics to address. And those articles that are part of our conversation in the second hour are on the website, pointofview.net. If you haven't taken the time to take action, support the SAVE Act, we encourage you to do that. You will notice we have a new banner up as well, 1776 to 2026, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. You might want to visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to focus some of our time and attention on Iran, but I do want to mention a little bit about an election that took place last night in Texas, only because it might have national significance. But just real quickly, let's mention the fact that we do see some very significant back and forth in the Iranian military action. We'll get into more of that in just a minute. 2 Iranian drones struck the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Fortunately, the building was empty, but it illustrates again one of the points we'll come back to a little bit later, and that is drone warfare, which has been developed rather significantly in the war between Russia and Ukraine, will show up there as well. Despite all the claims being made by the Iranian government that they closed the Strait of Hormuz, from which a very significant amount of oil comes through, the U.S. military said, we really don't agree with that. Central Command posted this response. 2 days ago, the Iranian regime had 11 ships in the Gulf of Oman. Today, they have 0. But we'll still hear some things about that, and that is just one more indication of why you need to pay attention to not only Point of View, but other sources of information, because if you get just one source of information, it may be very biased, but we'll see how this unfolds in the next couple of weeks and months. But let me also point to some articles we have by Cal Thomas, William McGurn, and others. But before we do so, last night was the primary for the state of Texas and a variety of other states, but I'll focus just on that for a couple of reasons. First of all, for those of you that were wondering if Jasmine Crockett has a future, well, at the moment, maybe not as a politician, although I think a lot of people think that she'll start working for the former MSNBC, now they call it MSN, I guess it is, but she was losing to James Tallarico, an individual I'm sure you're going to hear more about. But nevertheless, on the Republican side, you have a runoff between Ken Paxton and John Cornyn. Of course, both of them have been on the program with us before. And of course, there have been some people who have said, well, wouldn't the scandals surrounding, scandals with an S, surrounding Ken Paxton be enough for him not to be successful? But we will, over the next 12 weeks, probably not want to turn on our TV sets. I can imagine the back and forth in those ads. And, of course, another individual we've been watching, Tony Gonzalez, who, again, has been on the program but has his scandals of his own, might have been removed by Brandon Herrera. But, again, that one's going to a runoff. We may say more about this on Friday, because then we'll have a little better understanding of a couple of those cases. But for those of you that thought, well, once the primary is over, we can get on with our lives, no, because in the state of Texas, there will be a number of runoffs, Attorney General, Senate, and variety of other. On the Republican side, there'll be a few on the Democratic side as well. But the long-term perspective is interesting, because let's look at both parties. For a minute, you have 30 different House Democrats that are facing at least one primary challenger. Some were facing it last night in Texas or in a variety of other states, Arkansas and others. But these are unfolding now over the next couple of months. 30 different Democrats that are facing at least one primary challenger who's raised at least $100,000 or more. A dozen of them have been outraised by their rivals. So when you hear Democrats say, well, we're not sure we want to stand for the president, because if we do, then will be primaried. Well, you're seeing that unfold right now. There's been a little bit of an effort to unseat some incumbent Republicans. I just mentioned one, Ken Paxton wanting to unseat John Cornyn, but that is certainly the case. One of the more surprises that came is Dan Crenshaw. You might be familiar with Dan Crenshaw, an individual that lost his eye in his battle in the Middle East and has lost his seat. It looks like Al Green, who's the Democrat that stands up and always is evicted from the House of Representatives, heading to a runoff. He's a Democrat. Of course, we just mentioned Tony Gonzalez in a runoff as well. And I guess we have another one, Julie Johnson, in a runoff with Colin Allred, who has spent various amounts. So you'll see some of these House cases in which both Democrats and Republicans might lose their incumbent seats. And that is where I have said on this program before, the issue of affordability, which is our most current Outlook magazine, that affordability doesn't just affect Republicans, although it will affect them because there is a tradition, a trend, which is hard to buck, and that is the party that is out of power usually gains seats in the House of Representatives or the Senate. And so there is all the reason to believe that the Republicans may not control the House of Representatives after November. We'll see where that is. But there are some other things going on as well. One is the issue of ideology. Moderate and establishment House members find themselves having to defend themselves from being too weak. You know, Republicans talk about being a rhino, Republican in name only. Democrats talk about the fact that you haven't been fighting Trump enough. And so you're seeing some of these moderates facing some of these primary challenges. The other issue, which not as many people are talking about, but we have talked about it here on Point of View, is the issue of age. That is, after seeing President Biden's disastrous performance back in 2024 and the decision to have Kamala Harris run in his stead, you are still hearing all sorts of individuals, and matter of fact, I've mentioned Jasmine Crockett. She mentioned it more than once about the age of the individuals. She used words that we can't use here on the program, but nevertheless to describe that. So you're seeing that some of the older lawmakers might find themselves with these primary challenges. And then, of course, one other factor, which we've talked about many times, and that is the issue of redistricting. In the state of Texas, they had a mid-decade redrawing of congressional maps, and that is the case. And as a result, you've had some of the redistricting attempts in California and Virginia. Some of those have actually been challenged in the courts, but nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, we may have a little more turnover in the House, maybe not so much in the Senate, but certainly in the House, because as I oftentimes say, in the House, the legislators choose their voters because of redistricting. In the Senate, of course, the voters choose their senators because those are run by the state. But I think it is an illustration that we may see some more of these upsets that we saw last night in Texas and in a few other places around the country. So it's worth mentioning and certainly paying attention to, since we are for sure officially in the midterm elections, because the primaries held last night made some very significant changes, and we're going to see some more of that in the future. We come back, though, let's get back to what's going on in Iran, what is happening through the administration, what the prospects for peace look like, all that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Western civilization rests upon Christian values, and Western civilization is worth saving. That was the theme of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's message at the Munich Security Conference. He reminded the Europeans of our shared heritage. He said, "The men who settled and built the nation of my birth arrived on our shores carrying the memories and traditions and the Christian faith of their ancestors as a sacred inheritance, an unbreakable link between old world and the new." He added, "We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization for which we have fallen heir." Many seem to be rediscovering the truth that Christianity gave us Western culture, and it is necessary for it to function. We've seen many atheists who often surprise their audiences by acknowledging this fact and lauding the need for continued dependence on Christian values. Historian Tom Holland has been on my radio program to talk about his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. He argues that our Western world is deeply rooted in Christian ideas, and even our attitudes today are shaped by a Christian worldview that values human dignity, charity, and protection of the weak. He wrote those words as a secular historian, though I hear he has now become a Christian. Marco Rubio's speech was a reminder of the Christian foundations of our world and the need to return to those Christian values. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to spend some time talking about Iran. And by the way, if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. I suspect most of you want to just kind of sit back and hear a little bit more about what is taking place behind the scenes, and I'll try to give you some of that perspective. We didn't have a lot of time yesterday to cover it, so I did want to take at least a segment, maybe two, before we get to some other issues in the news, just to bring you up to date on a few things. And one way to look at this is to go to a piece that I've posted by our friend Cal Thomas, in which he says, if you want to look at it this way, President Trump is keeping his promise to end wars by taking out an Iranian regime that has made war on us and underwritten terrorism throughout the Middle East and the world since its 1979 revolution. Now, I know some people won't see it that way, but it's another way to think about the fact that if you are convinced that there are certain entities that are going to make the future worse, because they would have a nuclear weapon, and they already have ballistic missiles that at this point already travel 2,000 kilometers. Some of these more sophisticated rockets would travel all the way to this country. I think you want to pay attention to what has been happening in Iran. He says by killing Iran's top leadership, including the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and 40 others, President Trump has done what no other American president would do. People with Iranian heritage took to the streets across America to celebrate and praise U.S. and Israeli forces. Isn't it nice to see a pro-American demonstrators for a change? And, of course, I have interacted with a number of people in my own community. My wife and I walk twice a day, and some of them are Persians who came here from Iran, and it has been interesting to get their perspective of what it has been like for some of their family members that are in Iran and how they recognize that the chaos and turmoil, though not exactly what everybody would want, certainly has prohibited and prevented a lot of the persecution that some of the Christians have faced. But let's go on. He points out something else, which we will get to in due course. One of our articles is about terror in Austin, because he points out that, as Cal Thomas says, stories are now appearing online of Iranian sleeper cells that could attack and kill Americans here. If they do, the blame should go to President Biden and other administrations, he says, which let them in because of lax border and immigration policies. Better stay out of crowded places, including shopping malls and other target-rich environments. The State Department issued a travel warning for Americans. Just think about that for just a minute. We are now wondering whether or not there would be a terrorist attack. I will talk about the one in Austin in due course. That is our third article there. But nevertheless, it is an illustration of what we have to deal with when we don't take the time to properly vet people coming in. Just a minute, I want to go into a little bit more of the specifics of what that might mean in just a minute, because just looking for whether or not a person is carrying a Hamas or Hezbollah membership card. I'm being facetious, but just barely. I mean, that's kind of what we're looking for. That's not the issue at stake, and we'll get into that in a minute. But if nothing else, Cal Thomas ends his piece with a question and maybe even a statement. If, and he says, war always contains lots of ifs, but if the end of this operation is the turnover of Iran's government to leaders who will no longer promote terrorism, fully restore women's rights and a free press, honest voting, and repair relations with the United States and the West, President Trump will have become the most consequential president in decades. And, of course, said, well, he might even get the Nobel Peace Prize. Not playing in on that. But the point he's making is it's a big if. And the problem with the if, and we've talked about this before with regime change, we need to go into these conversations and even these military adventures with clear eyes and a clear perspective. It is difficult to build a democracy, much less a republic, on a Muslim soil. If indeed most of the individuals in Iran are Shiite Muslims, and they are, and even among those who've become Christians, it's one of the fastest growing places for Christian conversion in the world right now in terms of percentage, they're still not necessarily going to be thinking Christian ideas. They don't have much opportunity to learn a Christian worldview. But nevertheless, it is difficult, if for no other reason than just the whole question of representation, equal protection. There is a real concern about the fact that if you read the Quran, and I have, and we would certainly want to make available to you my booklet on Iran or some of the books I've written on Islam and Iran. But if you want to find some of the material that we've talked about in Islam and talk about the difference between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam, because Shiite Islam is found primarily in the southern part of Iraq and mostly in Iran, you recognize that they read the Quran as I think any honest individual would have to read it and say that the Quran basically says that a Muslim should enjoy greater rights and freedoms than a non-Muslim, and a man enjoys and should enjoy more rights and freedoms than a woman. And it's difficult to build a democracy on those kinds of ideas. So there are reasons to be skeptical about what we can do in terms of regime change, but anything that comes after that allows for a greater freedom, if nothing else, for the Christians, and at least some willingness to work with some of the countries in the region, even other Muslim countries, much less to no longer threaten Israel, would be a real plus. We'll see. Our next piece is by William McGurn, and he spends some time talking about some of these issues. And he certainly starts with the question, if Donald Trump were a Democrat, because he recognizes that some of the criticism that has come against Donald Trump comes simply because he's Donald Trump. For example, Chuck Schumer starts out, he's the Senate Minority Leader. Chuck Schumer says, Iran must never be allowed to attain a nuclear weapon, but, well, there comes the but. But the American people do not want another endless and costly war in the Middle East when there are so many problems at home. Well, we agree with that. And I would have to say that I believe that Donald Trump and Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Rubio agree with that as well. But nevertheless, that is the case. And so he talks about the fact, and he gives you other quotes from Hakeem Jeffries and Ilhar Oman and a number of others. He says, Washington's Democratic establishment is condemning President Trump either for not getting congressional authorization before striking Iran, or for simply striking Iran, or both. And he says the irony is Mr. Trump is doing what many Democrats imply should be done but would never do themselves. And so if you scroll down through this article, through about 3 huge paragraphs, you come to him reminding us of something that I wanted to put on the table. He says, remember Barack Obama in 2011. He intervened in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi's military to prevent a massacre in Benghazi. His administration argued that the War Powers Act wasn't violated because U.S. activities in Libya didn't meet the law's definition of hostilities, but Democrats weren't as upset then as they purport to be now. Now, the argument they come back is, well, it's one thing to have various kinds of strikes against Gaddafi. That's different than a full-scale war. We'll see. But he said later, Barack Obama came under pressure to prevent Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons on his own people in a bitter civil war. And in 2012, the president warned Mr. Assad that using chemical weapons would cross a red line and change the equation on U.S. military intervention. Well, the regime responded in 2013 with a sarin gas attack that killed more than, you ready for this, 1,400 people, including many children in the Damascus suburb, and Mr. Obama blinked. So again, William McGurn says it is hard to think of the last time a Democratic president followed through on a direct threat against a foreign adversary. It's hard to think of a time when Democratic voters held a Democratic president accountable for such a lack of follow-through, though critics on the left did complain that Joe Biden didn't take action against Israel after criticizing the Jewish state's efforts against Hamas. Just a reminder of what is sauce for the Democratic president is not sauce for the conservative or Republican president. And I think it illustrates, again, that we need to be a little more honest about what is the responsibility of the president, what is allowed under the Constitution, the War Powers Act, the idea of just war. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to get into that in more detail, but I wanted to at least surface the question right now before we take a break. I'll be right back.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
A little bit more on the issue of Iran, but then we're going to move to this country. Actually, in a sense, we already are, because the next 2 articles we're going to look at actually address what was happening here at home. But the first one, this one comes from the Washington Post, and it is a very kind of in-depth question about what was one of the motivating factors for Donald Trump, to actually want to attack Iran. And one of those factors, I think he's fair in which he deals with that, is the attempt to assassinate him. The title of the article is How Trump Assassination Attempts Played into His Decision to Attack Iran. He said on ABC the other day, I got him before he got me. You go, what's that all about? I remember when I brought this up on one of the walks my wife and I were doing, she was saying, well, does Donald Trump think that those attacks, those assassination attempts, we're thinking about the one in Butler, Pennsylvania, or the one at the West Palm Beach, were motivated by Iran? No. And this is where this helps us understand that the 20-year-old shooter in Butler, Pennsylvania, which is the one shot him in the ear, the other that attempted to shoot him, which was at the golf course there in West Palm Beach, these were obviously Americans, but there's also a trial beginning for a Pakistani man, and there are other attempts at trying to kill him that we're learning as well. As a matter of fact, in this article, he points out that Iranian officials were trying to kill Mike Pompeo as well as John Bolton, because those were individuals in the administration at the time that actually took out individuals. And really ever since Donald Trump, President Trump, called an airstrike to kill General Qasem Soleimani, that there has been a desire to kill him, and federal prosecutors have already charged two Iranian murder for hire schemes. So this goes into a little bit more detail than maybe most people are aware of. But just to use the example for a minute of Mike Pompeo, I wish he was back in the administration somehow, but nevertheless, I've always liked him. I have his book, Never Give an Inch, and just think very highly of him. We've had him on before. When he was speaking at my home church, you could see a fair amount of security, but I've told the story before that somebody was walking around to where the choir room was, and there they saw somebody who was set up there with a night vision scope on this rifle looking at the congregation in case there would be somebody who would rush into the church to try to assassinate Mike Pompeo. The other day, I went to go hear our good friend Ben Carson, and make sure you don't have a backpack. Make sure you don't have. Make sure you're not carrying. Can still carry. Make sure that there isn't any metal in your pocket. Let them wand you down as much as they want. And that's an individual who used to be in the administration for housing and urban development. The current Secretary of Housing and Urban Development goes to my church, and I've never seen him without 2 or 3 people surrounding him with various things in their ear, okay? And obviously they're packing. So this is, I think, just an illustration that we don't live in this world. Aren't you glad that you don't? Again, I told the story about Mike Pompeo when he comes to church and just needs to go to the men's room. They have to go in first and essentially clear everybody out, or at least check everybody out, just to take care of basics. And that's the world these individuals live in. And so, if nothing else, I thought this was a very good piece. Isaac Arnsdorf, writing for the Washington Post. And it is, again, the whole issue of the Trump assassination attempts and how I'm sure that played some part in this whole discussion as well. Was it the primary one? I think there were many other reasons besides that, but it's worth mentioning because hardly anybody else mentions it. That's why I thought we'd talk about it here on Point of View. Let me get to one more real quickly, and this one again is a home. In Austin, Texas, on the first day of March, you had a shooting spree that left 2 dead and 14 individuals wounded at a bar. I'm going to call it a bar complex. It's really more kind of a beer garden and everything in Austin. And it again was taking place the day after American and Israeli forces began their aerial invasion in Iran. And again, that left very little to the imagination. The old joke has always been that whenever the media sees a shooting like this, they always have to say, we really don't know the motive of this individual. But this gunman donned an Iranian flag T-shirt. Underneath was a sweatshirt emblazoned with "Property of Allah." I think we can guess his motivation and why he did what he did. He is an individual from Senegal, as best as we could determine. He came to the United States in the year 2000 on a tourist visa and probably did not leave. He's said to have married an American citizen, and that maybe allowed him to adjust his status. But nevertheless, if you are not familiar with the West African nation of Senegal, the population about 20 million, almost all of them are Muslim, so that is the case. And so they are exploring whether or not he has terrorist organizations. That's kind of standard practice. But this piece written by the editors of National Review went on to explain that maybe that's not the way to look over these issues, because as I've pointed out before, if you're looking for whether or not they've got a membership card of Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah or ISIS, probably not. And so that is at least a possibility. But in most cases, what they're saying is this. These individuals are motivated by a virulent ideology, they say. And what is that ideology? It's Sharia supremacism, the belief that societies must be coerced into accepting a harsh interpretation of Islamic law. They say the challenge is to marginalize this alien, anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Semitic ideology, not merely oppose the organizations it has spawned. And that's the issue. Somebody arrives here from a Muslim country, and in the past, in his first administration, President Trump said, can we maybe pause the allowing individuals from Muslim countries in here because we don't know what they believe. Now, I've used an example before of some really positive people that have come from Somalia, and you've heard us for some time talked about a lot of negative people that come from Somalia, so we don't always want to paint with a broad brush. But this ideology is in the minds of individuals, and we should begin to look for it. They go on to say that Sharia supremacism rejects our constitutional principles of individual liberty, equality, and anti-discrimination, as well as the peaceful resolution of policy disputes. They said a clear-eyed grasp of it would make it painfully apparent that would-be immigrants who adhere to the ideology will refuse to assimilate in our pluralistic society. Beyond that, some percentage of them will carry out violent attacks. That percentage, thankfully, is small, but the death and destruction they cause is outsized. Again, one of the benefits that I would encourage as we get closer to our Truth Team week, one of the benefits of being a member of Truth Team is we send out our booklets. And over the last 2 years, you've had booklets on Iran, or really on Islam, but we talk about Iran and all that. We've talked about the whole issue of Zionism. We've talked about the issue of Sharia law. That's a more recent booklet. We've put out a booklet on terrorism and how to fight the terrorist attacks that we have. And these are the kinds of resources we certainly want to put in your hands. You can certainly benefit from all the free material we post. If you go to our website right now, you're going to see 7 articles, I believe, if I'm counting right, at least 5 articles that I've got right in front of me, not to mention all the other links, but 5 articles that go to everything from Town Hall to National Review, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, whatever. But we also have, of course, my Viewpoints commentary, which I would encourage you to sign up for, which we'll get to in just a minute, and our Take Action items. But there is certainly a benefit to you joining with us financially on a regular basis, because these booklets that we have been sending out and will be continue to send out are one of the many benefits of you supporting this ministry. So I hope you'll consider that, because when we talk about this issue of terror and terrorist attacks, How should we think about this from a biblical point of view? And what can we and should we be doing to prevent those attacks coming from a community near you? Let's take a break. Going to move from this to Seattle socialists should be sleepless. Yep, they're sleepless in Seattle. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to be talking with Dr. Preston Springle, and again, we'll get into some very important issues. You might remember him as an individual that's written about everything from same-sex marriage and gender issues and a variety of others, so that will be a topic we will address. And then after he is gone, we will focus a little time and attention on the fact that the Supreme Court acted rather quickly on the question of whether or not in the state of California, the law that prohibits teachers from telling parents about the fact that their children want to do some kind of gender transition. Supreme Court said nope. And this is a very good piece written by the two teachers that said California told us to deceive parents, but we said no. So we'll talk about the implications of that. Come back and talk a little bit about some of the issues with Iran in Iraq, but also just a very good piece or two that we have from our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews. He's posted a piece about if you think we are having a problem with U.S. aid being stolen in the United States, look at the problem when we send it overseas. Very good piece there. And Colonel Alan West, who owns the American Story? That kind of gets us into the way in which Hollywood always tries to sanitize some of these very important issues with the kind of films they produce. So I think you'll appreciate that conversation. Friday is our weekend edition, and we have Liberty McCarter as well as Holly Randall with us. I think this is going to be a great week as we finish it off. But let me just real quickly point to an article by Chris Talgo. It is a sense if we will, the end of the bookend. Yesterday, I talked about on my commentary the New York mayor, Zohran Mamdani, who has released his first budget, which is $10 billion larger for New York City. The budget for New York City is $10 billion more than the budget for the entire state of Florida. And there aren't as many people in New York City as there are in Florida, so you can get the idea. But we actually have also not only a socialist mayor in New York City, we have a socialist mayor in Seattle, Katie Wilson. Now, I must admit that Katie Wilson isn't getting as much attention, especially since Zohran Mamdani is running a $12 billion deficit right now and wants to pull money from the rainy day fund as well as from the health benefits fund for retired city workers, and is threatening the governor of the state of New York and the legislators there in Albany, New York, that if they don't pass a wealth tax, then he is going to be forced, I love this line, to raise property taxes. Well, the Seattle mayor, Katie Wilson, delivered her State of the City address in which she immediately called for the city council to fund shelter expansion. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means, first of all, she wants to make sure there are more homeless shelters, which are going to be free, wants to expand child care. Pretty sure that's going to be free. Early education, I'm pretty sure that's free. Expand access to affordable food, increase rent subsidies. I mean, the budget alone, just from the word she said, now she has not given her budget, so we'll see, and also are determined to add 1,000 new units with services matched to meet people's needs, because this is all about the homeless issue. And if nothing else, even though New York City can't afford it, Seattle really cannot afford it, because the requirements for the budget in Seattle is that you have to have a balanced budget. And so each year, the Seattle City Council passes a balanced budget. I'm putting air quotes in the sky in case any of you are watching online. And you can see that it indeed has a budget shortfall so far of only $250+ million. And so this is just, again, one of the real significant issues, because Seattle spends lots of money. This year it will allocate, in round numbers, $8.9 billion for a population that is, well, in 2018 it was 743,000. And so, now maybe it's 800,000. But that's it. And it's, again, the argument. And, of course, how are we going to pay for it? Well, you knew the answer to that one. And that is, where does she say that? On February 14th, they said this on Valentine's Day. She made a speech describing the city as filthy rich, suggesting, quote, and this is her quote, progressive taxes on high earners are sustainable and lucrative, unquote. And then she went on to make some other things. And it is true that Seattle does have a millionaire's tax, which went into effect in 2025. And you might also remember what took place. Well, some of the people in Seattle said, maybe we want to leave. That would be, I don't know, Starbucks, although I think they're still there, Amazon, Microsoft, the list. I mean, it's just amazing. And again, for a city, as this particular article by Chris Talgo says, for a city drowning in debt like Seattle, curbing spending would certainly make some sense, but instead trying to raise taxes doesn't work. So I started my commentary yesterday on Zoran Mamdani on the fact that Margaret Thatcher said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Where Chris Talgo, in his piece on Seattle, ends by saying, as Margaret Thatcher so brilliantly put it, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. To be clear, socialism in Seattle is doomed to fail because Thatcher's axiom even applies to millionaires in the Emerald City. So his title of his piece, I couldn't resist it, Seattle Socialists Should Be Sleepless. So there's a reason to be sleepless in Seattle, and that is, how are you going to pay for the socialist, visionary, utopian dreams? You're not. And I think, if nothing else, we have two primary examples of why socialism doesn't work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is that many of these socialist leaders don't live in the world of reality. They don't understand what it takes to stimulate job growth, entrepreneurial activity, what it takes to actually be more efficient in city services. And as a result, we're going to once again have a very clear reminder of why we don't want more socialist governors, mayors, even people on city council. Just before we wind down, let me just mention my commentary today is about Western civilization. It's where I give you some significant quotes from, of all people, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who just again talked about the fact that Western civilization rests upon Christian values, and that Western civilization is worth saving, and reminded us of our shared heritage. They were all part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization for which we have fallen heir. Anyway, a very good piece, and also where I remind you that one of the people we had on the program, historian Tom Holland, when he wrote his book on Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, he wrote it as a secular historian, and I've heard now that he's become a Christian. So even the non-Christians have noticed the value of Christian ideas. It's all we have for today. I hope you will join us tomorrow, our Thursday edition, which will be talking about some really important issues. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Visit our website, pointofview.net. Some great resources there. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
You know as well as I do that elections matter. But political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.